Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland, so welcome back to my channel once more. So this is to mark the death of Vladimir Wolfovich Zhirinovsky, who died just 2 days ago. Well, it's its occasion to crack out the champagne. Death is not always tristful, so he will not be missed. His passing is mourned by all the wrong people. So he was this hyper-nationalist firebrand fool who made a name for himself with his ludicrous and distasteful antics over the past 30 years. Anyway, he's been called to his reward at the age of 75 years. So he was born in Almaty, father of the apple, it means in Kazakh, as in it's Kazakhstan. Of course, it was the Soviet Union at the time. So he was ethnically Russian on his mother's side. His father was a Ukrainian Jew, and Zhirinovsky was notorious for saying, my mother's Russian and my father's a doctor, or something like that, not saying his father's ethnicity or religious background. So they split when Zhirinovsky was quite little, and Zhirinovsky then he took his another surname. That's actually not really his name. Anyway, so yes, his father subsequently later immigrated to Israel. Zhirinovsky lost all contact with his father, and then he found out, I think in the 90s, his father had died sometime earlier. So Zhirinovsky, he studied law, he was certainly academic and so on, and had a not particularly distinguished career in the Soviet nomenclatura up until the 1980s. He was even briefly involved in a Jewish cultural organization. Certainly wasn't Jewish by faith. Identified with the Orthodox Christianity later on. He was married. He had children. He was outspokenly homophobic. Anyway, he began to be a bit unusual when the end of the 90s when he left the Communist Party and he set up the very ill-named Liberal Democrats. It was a misnomer if ever there was one. I'm sure the Liberal Democratic Party in the United Kingdom would like to disclaim all connection to the Liberal Democrats of Russia. So he was in touch with Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader of the National Front in France. So it was a sort of an ethno-nationalist outfit because there was this, how to put it, lacuna in the Russian psyche, because they no longer had communism, they no longer had the old lies to believe, and there was nothing left. There was a societal implosion, the economy appeared to be in free fall, and people very briefly discussed bringing back the Tsar. That wasn't going to happen. So what was the new ideology to be? And of course, many people lamented the breakup of the Soviet Union, and communism aside, there were some good things about those 15 countries being united. Okay, Azerbaijan and Armenia started knocking seven bells out of each other, so that was lamentable, but that was partly because of problems that the Soviet state had deliberately created, and indeed Russia actively taking a side, assisting the Armenians. And some of these conflicts, like in Georgia and so on, that's partly because of Russia. It's not because the Soviet Union broke up as such, but people who lamented the passing of the Soviet Union. But there were real difficulties. People woke up in different countries. Like I know a Russian who was born in Georgia, never wanted to be a Georgian. She was a Soviet, and suddenly she found she was a foreigner where she lived and didn't speak Georgian at all, and that was a disadvantage for her. And suppliers found that the people they were selling to were suddenly across an international border, and also the growing pains of establishing a new sovereign state. So he appealed to that nostalgia, that desire to rebuild the Soviet Union, but often specifically as the Russian Empire. No pretense that there was going to be any equality between the ethnicities under him. So the first Duma elections in 1993, he polled 23% of the vote. And remember, in the early 90s, they actually did have free and fair elections. For a few years, Russia was a genuine democracy. The trouble is, at the same time, there was bloody anarchy. And I mean bloody not in the metaphorical sense. And there was rampant gangsterism, hyperinflation, mass unemployment. Even if you had a job, you might not be paid for months. I know people who are paid in ashtrays, or they're paid in items, not cash. And so it was horrific for many people. And of course, the robber barons were making out like bandits when all these oil fields and so on were sold off. But so Zhirinovsky, he identified a need that people had. There was this gap in the market for a party which was had these ultranationalist and irredentist ideas to sell. Leaked documents suggest that the Liberal Democrats actually founded by the KGB, the Soviet Security Service, as in a party to test out ideas on public opinion, seemingly outrageous ideas. But he's long lamented the loss of the non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union. Want to bring them back. He stood for the president several times. This perennial candidate didn't do so well, but he's very much part of this systemic opposition, as in never seriously challenging Putin, never really criticizing him. And he vowed that there'll be a police state, saying that if he came to office, you know, tens of thousands of people would be immediately executed, but there'd be no more robbery, and the people would be better off. And that did appeal to people who really had been robbed blind, who in the communist days, though they weren't rich, there was a social floor, and the basics of life were guaranteed. You would have just enough to eat, you would have a grim studio flat to live in, and you would have free education, and you would have free healthcare, and public transport was very cheap, and heating was free, and all the rest of it. And all of a sudden that was gone. None of that was guaranteed any longer. So Zhirinovsky was an outspoken enemy of freedom of expression, of really rights. So he was totalitarian. I mean, he was a fascist, I suppose, by just about any definition. A communist, he didn't particularly concern himself with economics, and though he railed against capitalism and so on, he was a very acquisitive and avaricious capitalist himself. He certainly was no slouch at amassing private property. Anyway, so he wanted to take back Kazakhstan, all the other former Soviet republics. Remember, of course, he was born in Kazakhstan, and the Kazakhs were actually an ethnic minority in their own homeland until the 1990s. For some decades they were. That's partly because Stalin had deliberately starved so many of them to death in the 1930s. And he was a real outlier amongst Russian politicians, Zhirinovsky, saying they should take back Alaska, that they could quickly reduce the United States to radioactive ash. And despite being half Jewish, he often fulminated against Israel. And he's quite anti-Muslim, against the indigenous ethnic minorities in the Caucasus, like the Chechens, Ingushet, in Dagestan. He's saying, you know, we should kill far more of them and they should be expelled and blah, 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 and appealing to a flagrantly racist sentiment. So, yeah, that was him. And he identified himself with the Russian Orthodox Church, who did nothing to decry his deeply un-Christian sentiments towards others. And he was, again, an outspoken advocate of war crimes, said that, you know, that nuclear weapons should be used against Chechen civilians, and on and on. I mean, really just beyond outrageous, nauseatingly, horrifically, shockingly cruel and inhumane in his beliefs. And this resonated with a large segment of the population. He was a real vulgarian. Condoleezza Rice, the US Secretary of State, calling her a black whore and so on, and saying that she could be gang-banged by Russian soldiers, and wow. Anyway, so that is Zhirinovsky, and he certainly had the ear of Putin, and Putin's more or less doing what he wanted. And so how apposite that Zhirinovsky should die during the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. And indeed, he forecast that it was going to happen the 22nd of February this year. He forecast that Midwinter's Day last year. So it seems like there was a plan. I mean, actually, the plan was to start about 8 days earlier, but they had to postpone it because they had logistical headaches, which they obviously didn't really manage to sort out. Another thing is, Zhirinovsky, unsurprisingly, he was a fulsome praiser of Donald Trump. So that's him. He used to assault people. He was certainly verbally abusive as well. It was pretty horrific. So he caught coronavirus, he died, and he's been honoured. His body's lain in state in the Hall of the Unions, where the Soviet leaders, they lay in state before their funeral. So Putin was there to pay his respects, to lay a wreath, to bow to him, to bless himself, and so on. So Zhirinovsky, I'm very glad that he's not seen what he wanted to come to pass. So he was really horrific. He was an absolute ogre, and I'm very glad he's gone. Unfortunately, the bacillus of ultranationalism in Russia has metastasized. I hope that's not a mixed metaphor. And certainly he's planted this seed of these hyper-nationalist, militarist, ultra-aggressive ideas in the minds of many, many people. And sadly, his views are more or less mainstream in Russia right now, and they are disseminated by the state media, and the state controls virtually all the media, either directly or indirectly owns it, as well as their strict censorship. So it's a very dark vision for the world he's got, and he's a man after Putin's own heart. So Zhirinovsky has died. Sadly, Zhirinovskyism is not dead, and I really would like to drive a wooden stake through its heart. But it's not going to be easy, and this conflict is going to drag on. It seems like there's more of a long war strategy, which in a way makes the sanctions even more important, because they always say sanctions take a while to bite, and they are biting. Now, they say Putin would like to win by the 9th of May, by Victory Day. That's only 30 days away. You have something he can sell to the people as a victory, grab a bit more of Donbass, and they've already advanced a bit in Donbass. But I mean, just because they think they're finished doesn't mean the Ukrainians are going to give up, because it takes two to make peace as well. The Ukrainians say, well, it's not accepting that. We're going to carry on firing at you. We're going to firing at you. We're going to counterattack. So anyway, that's Zhirinovsky. Good riddance to bad rubbish. Toodle pip.